Welcome to this interview for the IRF Summit Authors Corner. Joining us for the conversation today is Professor Sean Roberts from the George Washington University here in Washington, D.C. To discuss his book on the war on the Uyghurs. Professor Roberts, thank you so much for joining this conversation, talking about this book that came out just a couple of years ago, but is the culmination of work that you've been doing in and around the Uyghur community dating back 30 plus years?
Yeah, about 30 years, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's our privilege. So take us into the story behind the story. How did you come to write this book?
Well, so I started studying Uyghurs when I was still in graduate school in the 1990s and did a lot of field work in Central Asia and Kazakhstan, and I would go into China but not do formal interviews inside China, because even in the 1990s, it was a highly politically sensitive issue for the Chinese state. After starting to work at George Washington University, I decided, in terms of writing a book, to focus on how the war on terror had impacted the Uyghurs, because it was through the 90s, there were issues where China, the Chinese state, was focused on the religiosity of the Uyghurs, seeing that as a dimension of their national identity, national pride, and kind of desire for self-determination in the region they see as their homeland. But when the war on terror started, one very little-known Uyghur organization that I was not even aware of at the time, that was in Afghanistan, was labeled a terrorist group first by the Chinese government, and then the Chinese state was able to get the United States to recognize that and help them get the UN to recognize this group. And that really changed, I think, the dimension of the repression on the Uyghur people inside China. So I started doing research into that going back to about 2011 or so. And that took me to a lot of different places, not to China itself anymore, because I had already been essentially blacklisted from doing research in China. But I went to Albania because there were some Uyghurs who were in Guantanamo Bay, who had been found in Pakistan, and they had been released subsequently, and the United States did not want to send them back to China, so they found third countries where they could go, one of which was Albania. I also spent a lot of time in Turkey because after very intense event in 2008, in the summer of 2008, which involved ethnic riots and ethnic violence in the capital city of the Uyghur homeland, Urumqi, you had a constant flow of migrants to Turkey because they knew that going to Turkey meant that they could get refuge and Turkey would not extradite them to China. So I spent a lot of time in Turkey also interviewing people who had been leaving during that time. And I also tried to make sense of the fairly marginal part of the Uyghur diaspora that had joined jihadist groups since that time, and following their videos and writings to try to really understand whether this allegation that there's a major terrorist threat had any legitimacy whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the values of this book of looking at that security threat. It's certainly something that China's used with relation to the Uyghurs, but we've seen that also used in other places, in Burma with Rohingya being pointed toward that, even other communities in the Middle East. There's this, once you get a terrorism designation for even as minuscule of an event as it is, it becomes the vehicle for justification for all sorts of other repression. How much from your research was that legitimate security threat, if it was there, a driving force, versus the religious and ethnic difference and these kind of questions about space for religious cultural difference within a society, really the fracture point of what was going on?
Yeah, I think it was much more the latter. I think I look at the situation as being very similar to the fate of the victims of settler colonialism elsewhere in the world, right? Where you have a dominant society, and this one, the People's Republic of China, has a particular interest in the idea of homogeneity within society. And they wanted, increasingly beginning in the 1990s, but particularly in the 2000s, the Chinese government wanted to develop this area and make it much more part of a generic Chinese state, culture, civil society, so on and so forth. And that, I think, was the main reason that the Chinese government has gone to the extents that it has, particularly since 2018. But I think that the global war on terror gave them a justification, and in particular to focus on religiosity, because I think that one of the faults in the global war on terror is that it has increasingly seen the source of a security threat as being in religion. And so even when there is not really a substantive security threat, if you can succeed in labeling a group, an ethnic group, a religious group, as terrorists, that justifies going after their religion as the core reason behind their security threat.
Yeah, and it's interesting. This is for those of us working on the religious freedom space, have been really pressing into this, the connection between greater levels of religious freedom and security. And there's the argument that the Chinese state or others would make that, no, this is a security threat, we need to clamp down on them. But there's actually a lot of evidence that say that increased levels of repression increases both the incubation and the exportation of religion-related violence. And it goes in two ways. One is kind of the idea of terrorism as the voice of the oppressed, and so that crackdown, we don't have another choice but to use violence. That happens certainly at some point. But the other is also when a group is marginalized, actors attack them, and so it's actually also a tool of the oppressors farther that sort of marginalization. From the situation with the Uyghurs, in that dealing with the security side, have there been negative security implications as a result of the heightened repression?
Absolutely. So one of the core arguments in my book, we saw this increase in civic disorder, violence in the Uyghur region of China, starting in around, beginning with this riot, then this ethnic violence I had mentioned, which had nothing to do with religion. It was much more, I think, an outcome of the tensions of mass top-down development, because you had this development starting as early as 2000, a little bit before that, but it really ramps up increasingly in the 2000s. And by 2008, you had a lot of Han Chinese migrants coming to the region to settle, because the development was actually encouraging settlement there. And you had a lot of Uyghurs feeling marginalized by this development, feeling displaced. And the ethnic violence that occurred in the city in the summer of 2008 was really an outcome of that. But after that, of course, the state really clamped down on Uyghurs, and they decided that Uyghurs were at fault, even though there was violence on both sides. It was not just Uyghur on Han violence, it was Han on Uyghur violence as well. But they also decided that the violence was due to the particularly religious Uyghurs from the south of the region. A lot of them who were labor migrants to the city, right? And they already were disenfranchised, living sometimes in kind of squatter communities and so on. And so there was a massive crackdown on religion after those riots. And what we saw is people started, particularly in rural areas in the south of the Uyghur region, they started to lash out at security organs that were repressing them, and that led to what I term kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where you have violence, repression met with resistance, leading to more repression, more resistance. And by 2013-14, there were a handful of events that were actually, I would term, terrorist attacks. But they were not linked to the global jihadist movement. They were just basically locally fueled tension, and instead of just lashing out at security organs, they also started to lash out at Han civilians.
Yeah, and that repression often hardens the social divisions and leads toward, whether state-targeted or society-targeted violence as well. Your book particularly situates this issue within the global war on terror, the response to terrorism, violent extremism. On the policy side, we'll start there, and then we'd love to come to your work as well in international development. What are the lessons that maybe have been learned or should be learned from security actors, those working in counterterrorism and others, from the Uyghur case?
Well, I mean, in my work in international development, I've done some work around what is termed in the U.S. countering violent extremism, right? And I think that one of the problematic aspects of the CVE movement is focusing on religion as the ideology behind what's happening. Really, what is usually happening is people are disenfranchised, and they're looking for any vehicle that will allow them to lash out at what is disenfranchising them. And so I think that focusing on what's often called the push factors in CVE, the factors, being a marginalized community, having your rights violated, those are the things that is liable to send people towards more extremes. Yep. And so I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is, in some ways, I'm concerned about the idea of extremism. I find terrorism a concrete concept, which I define in my book as deliberate attacks on civilians. However, extremism is a very subjective term, and so it also starts to get into thought control, right? So the idea that we have to prevent people from adopting what we decide are extreme religious ideas or ideological ideas. And I think that's problematic. I think that maybe in the future, as we see the focus on extremism going beyond the focus on Islam, perhaps we can get to an idea of promoting tolerance, right? Yeah. So that I do think that you could maybe define extreme ideas as those that cultivate hate against other groups. Mm-hmm. And establishing, an idea of religious tolerance is something that really could go a long way to solving this problem, which, we've already been living more than 20 years and arguably has been an issue for centuries. Right?
Yeah, and I remember someone, maybe a skeptic of that tolerance or religious freedom, was saying that focusing on that, it's really like bringing not even a knife to a gunfight, but it's almost a piece of paper to a gunfight. But the reality is that those factors of marginalization, exclusion, they create the context that push individuals into pursuing other violent types of actions. And,
absolutely.
Is that message getting through when it comes to both policymakers and then programmatically, as you look at the whether it's the U.S. or other countries that hundreds of millions of dollars around governance, democracy, other types of kind of development assistance, cultural engagement of various sorts. is this message getting through of how much those fractures around maybe ethnicity and maybe culture, it's often religion, that matters?
I think it's not a very strong aspect of global development right now. I think that it's starting to become, and I think one of the positive things, looking at the U.S., is there had been a time where this had been painted as a partisan issue, but now I think that we've seen successive different administrations from different parties, and the call for religious freedom has remained something that is bipartisan. And it's an understanding that these fractures are very real. I mean, I'm an anthropologist by training, and so I've always been frustrated that development did not engage culture more. And I think this is an area where it can, and it really is about tolerance. It's about the idea of embracing diversity as a strength rather than as a fracture problem.
Yeah, and your book certainly focuses on the Uyghur situation, China in particular. Your work is more broad than that in Central Asia as well. Are there any places where you see positive development, positive movement toward this happening, that are things we ought to lean into or look to replicate or tell those stories better of where there are positive steps happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some areas where we're seeing, particularly, because I think when we look at, going back to the global war on terror, when we look at Syria, the conflict in Syria was so complex. There were so many different players. It becomes much more difficult to say these are the terrorists and these are the freedom fighters, right? Yep. Because this has long been, an argument about terrorism, that it's the subjective determination of what is a terrorist, what is a freedom fighter. And I think that we're seeing some states, and in Central Asia actually, a place which is, Central Asian states are not particularly embracing of liberal values, of democracy and so on, but they're working very hard to reintegrate people who had gone to Syria to fight and try to understand why they were there. Also, not just universally condemning them. It's a difference between a woman who went with her husband and never fought, and her husband who maybe was involved in violence, right? So, those different constituents have to be dealt with differently. So, I mean, I think that there is some hope in that way, and I feel that the U.S. Could do a lot more in our own policy in terms of this, because I think we're still kind of stuck on this idea of a very kind of objective idea of what a terrorist is. That is in reality a completely subjective determination, and inevitably involves religion as a central part of it. And for the Uyghurs, the other thing that's very important right now, I think when we talk about a genocide in the Uyghur region, it's not necessarily like the Holocaust. It does involve mass internment camps, and it is specifically focused on religion, but it is in many ways much more like what it was done to Native Americans, what's been done in other settler colonial regimes, where the intent is to displace these people and kind of homogenize them in a way that makes them assimilated into the dominant culture. And I think that what Uyghurs are starting to realize in diaspora, and there's a significant diaspora population spread out through the world, is that they have to retain their language and culture outside of China, because it's conceivable within a decade or two that it's going to essentially disappear within China.
Yeah, and that's, as you mentioned, the the forms of genocide, it certainly is the atrocities that are happening to individuals. I think you talk to any Uyghur, and the number of family members that have been disappeared is astounding. But it's a whole-scale erasure of culture and overall presence, either displaced, destroyed, or in some cases assimilated in horrible ways, which also opens the space for the other tools that are there around cultural heritage protection and maintenance of diversities, and that's a different approach than seems a far way to go from the global war on terror and kind of the hard security responses, but they're different ends of the spectrum to addressing these issues. Has there been awareness in some of your work of the need to address this from the cultural heritage or other angles?
Well, some of my recent kind of applied work, I've done some work for the U.S. Institute for Peace, because they have a small grant fund that they want to use for cultural maintenance and cultural preservation among Uyghurs, and the report I did for them has kind of spurred them to think about: should this be a part of the peace building kind of lexicon? Should this be something that is a part of peace building? And I think that's really positive to see that you have people who are focused on issues of peace building and stopping conflict, and they're realizing that these cultural issues have to be dealt with in order to really establish sustainable peace in the world.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Professor Roberts, thank you so much for joining us to tell the story of your book and the impact of the war on the Uyghurs and why it matters for that community, but also its relevance to so many other aspects of advancing peace and the value of religious freedom within this. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.